Welcome to another webinar. We're going to be talking about continuous security validation today. It's a topic that most of the security leaders are thinking about it, and there not seems to be a whole lot of awareness. So today we brought two panelists. One is actually practitioner CISO who have implemented continuous security validation in his program, and the other one is field CISO who is listening to customers' problems and solving them. My name is Victor Monga. I will be the moderator and keeping time check, honestly. This webinar is again float and conversation style, informal, where we talk about the continuous security validation. We'll talk about when is the right time to consider it, how to optimize it, and the challenges, how to adopt it. So with that, I want to introduce my panelists, and we'll pass it on to them as well to formally introduce them. First is Navy George, who is VP of IT Operations and Information Security at Pacific Dental. I don't know how this guy does it. Seriously, he has figured out how to beat the sleep. He serves the community, he mentors the people, and again, keeps his company risk-free. With that, Nami, I want you to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Victor. Name me George. As Victor says, I work at Pacific Dental Services, responsible for a big chunk of the IT group, but also the information security team. Been here about 8 years, and I also serve as the president of ISACA Orange County. Have a group of security professionals, and we talk all things InfoSec, cybersecurity, audits, internal risk assessments, controls, and all things governance.
My second panelist, Jay. So Jay has been in cybersecurity for the past 15 years. He has worked in this industry and covered South and North America. The key hidden gem about Jay is that he is really fascinated about martial arts and he practices. So I don't want to be on his bad books. He's also really passionate about this topic, continuous security validation. Jay, welcome.
Thanks, Victor. Really appreciate you guys being here. Yeah, it's a really important topic. So I spent most of my career on the blue side, defensive side of technology. And the one thing that is oftentimes neglected or not done enough is validation of those controls and of security in general. So now here as field CISO at Pantera, that is our goal, to make sure that the message and the continuous validation of all controls and processes are done.
Excellent. Well, let's start with that, the definition of continuous security validation. There's so many out there. Every vendor has their own flavor of it. Every practitioner has their own understanding of it, which is fine. So I want to start this question from you, Jay, that what does security validation means to you? You must have heard different flavors of it, different definitions of it from different customers. Give us that little conversation about what does security validation means to you?
Yeah, security validation is really the check of all the controls and processes that you've put in for your security program. I think traditionally the way it was done, though, it was done once or twice a year, and unfortunately it's just not enough due to the dynamic nature of the environment, especially when we start talking about cloud and the automation that comes along with that. There's a lot of other risks that can be introduced that if you don't have a constant pulse on what that posture is, you're going to be out of luck in case something bad happens. So for me, it's a continuous process that should be happening all the time.
Yeah. I know when I started in security, it was always, hey, do your annual pen test and you're good to go. Or vulnerability management. At that time, it was more like assessment. Scan your vulnerabilities and you're good to go. You report on that. But that's not enough. It's not cutting it. We know that. We want to know where we are investing in our technology stack or information security stack, how effective they are. Yes, every vendor, they have their own flavor of knowing how the ROI is built for the product, but in a way where you are looking at holistically and against the threat actors. Yes, the implementation of the vendor technology can really give you the ROI, but the effectiveness of the controls is really that we want to hear. Maybe you have implemented security control validation at Pacific Dental. Give me that, what was the need of it, or what was the definition of security validation when you started here at Pacific Dental?
Well, I think you just have to go back to just the basics, right? When we talk about security validation, there's nothing inherently complex about what we're doing. We're just doing, it's a common sense approach, right? And when you run large security organizations, you tend to want to buy a lot of technology tools and all of those things. But at some point, you have to ask yourself as a leader, how much is too much? am I getting the best from what I already have? And where are my weak spots? Where do I need to invest additional controls? I was talking to someone the other day, and he said something that I'm probably going to say wrong, but I told him I was going to steal it. And he goes, look, I don't want to have another 95 controls validating or securing my identity and have no controls on my cloud environment, for instance. And a lot of times you find we are skewed in one direction. It might be towards a particular vendor, or if you take the MITRE ATT&CK framework, when you go from identify, detect, prevent, recover, and so on, you have a lot of vendors or a lot of organizations that stack a lot of their controls to the left, meaning they want visibility, they want to identify issues, they want to detect issues, and if lucky, they want to prevent issues, right? But there are times when you've got to think further down. How do you respond? How do you recover? And so the ability to have a continual check across your controls to see how you're balanced in your implementation, but also the investments you've made, if you're getting the ROI from those investments, that's really what security validation is. And it cannot be a one-time thing because our environments change so quickly. And if you're doing a routine assessment, whether that is once a month or once a year, you just need to have a system that validates your controls around the clock.
And you said it right. I think there's one thing I remember you mentioned it to me that if I have 90 platforms or solutions in my company, the 91st has to be 80th.
Yeah.
The next one has to cut down, and it's not easy when we are working with our smart security architects, engineers, or the core staff. They want to keep those tools because it's helping them. But in order to know the effectiveness of it, I think that's where the whole conversation starts, that how do I know which one to cut and which one to keep? The conversation is, how do I know which ones are effective? All of that sounds good, I think. Maybe when you implemented this solution or the mindset of security validation here at Pacific Dental, what were the things that really hindered to get to that point? I'm sure the road was not as smooth as we think. What were those road bumps as you started evangelizing that topic or the conversations within your security and across the table?
Well, I think the first thing you run into when you do things like this is just a mindset. People think when you talk about offensive security or continual testing, people think you're just letting the tools take over, right? It's almost like now you're going to have the ability to pen test 24/7, run vulnerability assessments all year round, and typically the first pushback you get is from the asset owners. Let's just use a general term, the asset owners, right? The people who own the servers, who own the applications, who own the networks, the systems that you are going to be prodding and scanning. The first thing is, this is a legacy system. Continual validation of controls will increase the load on these systems. You're going to take things down. All of those things are the usual pushback you get. But, you've just got to get to, sometimes you just have to be direct with what you're looking to do. We're not doing this to inconvenience the business. We're not doing this to add extra load. But the folks who are out there, the adversaries who are trying to get into your organization, they're not making any of those considerations.
Yep.
So you do have to test your defenses. And of course you have to be mindful of the business. If there, in some cases, rarely, but in some cases, there's good reason why you may need to alter your test approach. And you have to be cognizant of those reasons and alter your test. But you do have to test, you do have to validate. That is, table stakes, and that's not negotiable at all. So we have to push through that and get the program implemented.
Yeah. Jay, you must have heard good reasons why to adopt security validation, but also challenges, right? So one of the challenges I can see it where companies, they are like, we have annual or biannual penetration testers, why do I need it? So that's one technological. But the other one is that the problem where the internal environment or the politics where, hey, now that you're going to be bringing this validation, which is going to constantly check, so there's like a big brother watching me, that mindset and the challenge is, what have you heard when it comes to security validation and how people just overcome that and really help the companies to reduce the risk and really understand there is a place for penetration tester. There is a place for continuous security validation, automated and autonomous. What are those challenges you have heard?
Well, to echo what Nemi was saying, we hear all the time that, hey, you're going to bring things offline, you're going to do damage. I completely get that. I mean, here at Pantera, we take a lot of pride in not doing that. And in fact, we wouldn't be in business if we did. So I think there's ways to get around that. A lot of challenges, though, that I see is the friction between teams, which I think if you're in security, you know, like you're not in security if you haven't had friction with other teams. It's just the nature of the beast. And what I've seen make programs really successful is where it's driven from the top down, but that has to come from the top down. So that evangelism and that need needs to be articulated and understood first, and then hopefully everybody knows that security is ultimately their responsibility as well. And I've seen issues where security validation has found that, for example, Windows GPO policies, the Windows team, the infrastructure team, thinks that they've rolled that out. And then we went to go verify, and it hasn't been. And it's no one's fault. It just hasn't been. There's a glitch in the matrix, glitch in the system, ghost in the machine, right? I hear that all the time, but you don't know until you validate it. So for me, it's making sure that the business understands that this is in the best interest of the business to make sure that we're finding risks or gaps and validating before attackers do. Once you've articulated that, things tend to move a little bit more smoothly.
Yeah. And that's fair. I think one thing I want to ask both of you is that, which I'm sure you have heard it, Jay, when is the right time? Is it part of cloud security initiative when I involve security validation? Is it part of when I am implementing a new ERP system? Or is it part of my general hygiene? So when is the right time? At what stage of the project in security I should involve security validation? And I want to hear from both of you before I give my advice on that one.
I'm very interested to hear what you'll say, Nemi, and then I'll toss it to you first.
Well, I think, going back to what I said initially, when you think about security validation as just essentially doing good hygiene, right? The right time is now. There is just no time to do it. It's going to be a lot of work when you decide to do it. So, it's like people say, eat the frog, right? It's that ugly thing you don't want to deal with and you keep pushing it away. You just got to do it. And then the other thing about validation is it may not be one tool, may not be one platform. Some validation may be manual. Everything doesn't have to be automated. Now, we want to be automated because we know it's repeatable, reliable, it's consistent, and all of those benefits. But look across your environment, and you might have processes that just require a person to go run a script manually, or just old school interview someone, speak to someone, and ask them, right? We're doing, I'll give you an example. We're launching a series of websites for the offices we support, and we're not able to do validation, automated validation, because the way the vendor, essentially, you need an explicit rule to allow traffic through, and if you don't have that, it drops everything. So it's like, well, this is a real life scenario where I am not going to have whitelists for my attackers. So I don't want to drop the security of the tool just to allow my validation tool come in. It's like, well, here's what we're going to do. What is your best practice from the vendor and internally? How are you configuring those assets? We're going to have a program where we'll come in and we're going to validate that you build it and you're configuring to best practice. We're going to do that on a fairly routine basis.
Yeah.
Now, that's not a substitute for validation, but faced with, we have a deadline, we have to go live, and we essentially have to change the architecture of this platform to allow your validation to come in. Well, here's the next best thing. Rather than, no, we're not going to do it, or you both are, get to an impasse and then nothing happens. So you've got to validate how you do it. Organizations might differ on that. If you can automate it and have a repeatable process, that's the gold standard. If you can't, figure out something else, because it's got to be done.
I'll toss the same question to you.
Yeah, I mean, I laughed when you said the time is now, because naturally I'm going to say that as well. I think when we come in and we see all different types of organizations, large, small, and all different industry verticals, the first question I ask is, well, what are you doing today? So sometimes it's the once or twice a year. That's pretty common. Sometimes it's nothing at all, and sometimes it's mature. So what I want to do first is understand what the current program is, and then it's always taking it one step further, one step further, one step further.
Yeah.
The maturest organizations that I've worked with actually are doing it daily in different parts of the network and using a tool or a platform like Pentera, like ours, to help augment the efforts as well,
Right.
just to help scalability and to help comprehensive testing in all parts of the environment. I don't think there's ever a good quote unquote time because, again, like we mentioned, the nature of the environment is always so dynamic. So by running, and this is where the lens and the mindset of the attacker really comes into play, we can at least start to see, well, maybe we should focus, and this is where I do sometimes recommend focusing on critical assets. What's critical to the business? If something were to go down or something were to affect the availability of the information, then that could spell certain doom. We should probably validate the controls around that to make sure that first information is available and that it doesn't go down, because that is a part of security as well.
Yeah. So that sounds promising. I think it also sounds natural that you want to know that what you have implemented when it comes to security controls, that you have validated it. One of the research or the survey we did, 91% CISOs or security leaders are feeling that they actually don't know what's deployed in their organization. They have the security tools, they have purchased it, they know those security tools are capable of detecting, preventing, and even responding, recovering as well, but they don't know how effective they are. Now that's a conversation we're having today. That when is the right time to know, A, are they effective? B, what do we need to do to make them effective? And C, how to consolidate. Everybody's talking about this magical single pane of glass, and I think I call it more like pain in the butt, honestly. People tried it. Every vendor had tried it, tried to integrate, tried to figure out a way, APIs or logs to figure out that single pane of glass. Let's face the music. Let's first hold those vendors accountable that what they're promising, is it actually effective? Let's hold our internal team accountable that you told me that you will configure this solution to identify, detect, protect, prevent, whatever you want to do with that. Is it happening? Is it doing it? I want to ask you, Nemi, when you started considering security validation at Pacific Dental, what were those key areas when it comes to the gaps when you were looking at that? I want to know the effectiveness of those security controls. Like, were they more like endpoint security, network security, cloud security? You have a wide stack of applications here. What were those priorities that you wanted to see that I want to know the effectiveness of those security controls, either to consolidate or to tune and tweak it better?
Well, I think the way you go about it is something that Jay mentioned earlier, which is when you read through every security framework out there, they all start with a focus on the asset.
Yeah.
Right? Now, you can take that a level above and then you can focus on critical assets or business, productivity assets, whatever the case is. But you have to focus on your assets. That's one piece. Now, it sounds easy. A lot of people don't do that. Then it gets worse. I mean, a lot worse. We then look at security controls. When we look to apply controls to, within our organizations, I think the very first thing people should do is build a scope of assets. So let me put it this way. If you're implementing, say, vulnerability management, you take a tool like Tanium, ask yourself the question, of all of these assets that I've identified, what is Tanium able to patch? Now, in the case of Tanium, you deploy an agent, and so everything you can deploy an agent on, you're able to patch. You make that assumption. Might not be correct, but let's go with that. You then look at how many other assets do I have across my organization for which I cannot deploy an agent.
Yeah.
You then start looking at, and these may be IoT type devices and other devices that you cannot deploy an agent. Then you start looking at your cloud resources and SaaS applications and all of these other things. So you've got to build a very clear picture of assets, applicable controls, and then you then discover the gaps that you have. Now, once you've done that, you then start asking yourself another fundamental question, which is, what is your deployed base? Yeah. So for instance, take Tanium, SCCM, or any of these tools. If I have 40,000 endpoints that I have discovered, am I deployed to 100% of those endpoints? And do I really have 40,000 endpoints? How do you validate that because you're only reporting on the endpoints for which you have an agent deployed.
Yeah.
This doesn't include, the person who's left and their manager has their laptop in their drawer somewhere waiting for the new starter to come in. So the point I'm making is you've got to close that gap of identifiable assets to deployable assets to the controls that you have across those assets. Once you've built that picture to a really high degree of accuracy, and if you're able to hit 95%, you are doing a fantastic job. Once you've done all of that, you then start asking yourself, this is where a tool like Pantera comes in, to then say, assuming I have all of these controls deployed to all of these assets that I've discovered, what should they be doing? How should they be protecting my environment? And everyone is going to give you the answers. Well, it's going to prevent malware. It's going to prevent ransomware. It's going to prevent. So maybe identify the top 10 things that these controls are meant to prevent against. And that's when you bring in a tool to validate, to say, okay, well, let's see. Let's see what happens. Now, my advice to folks listening to this is if you can, and it's a big if because resource is always a challenge, if you can, separate the team that is doing the implementation, the engineering, the deployment of controls from the team that's validating the controls, right? Have two different groups, and then you go validating those controls. And they shouldn't have to work in sync, right? If you know I'm going to validate all of these controls, and then you have the time to put your house in order, it is not really a validation, right? So they should work kind of asynchronous and just kind of get at it, have independent lines of reporting. That way if those controls are actually doing what they're meant to do, but more importantly, that if they're doing what they're meant to do, they're doing it across the entire base, rather than a segment of devices or assets that they've discovered because it was easy to do that at the time.
Yeah, that's a very good advice. I think that gives a good roadmap for those who are listening and they are considering to implement security validation. It seems like that you need to boil the ocean. Not really. Naomi just gave you a roadmap where you start and build upon it and have those 5 or 10 criteria to the critical assets or the assets you have identified and measure those controls. Jay, I want to ask you this question. When we are considering security validation, and always it's the technical controls we can validate, and we start talking about those with IT as well, because there's an overlap when it comes to security controls and we rely upon IT. Do you see a pushback? Do you hear a pushback from companies or customers where they're like, well, you are security people, you want to measure or validate your security controls by all means, but I don't want you to validate my IT implementations?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, again, it goes back to what I was saying before about the friction between teams. And I do see a lot of that. And it inherently, naturally, though, because security touches so many things, like when we look at technologies, for example, you look at SIEM technologies, right? SIEM technology interfaces with Windows and Linux and databases and EDR and all this other stuff. It becomes a central point of a location for all this data. Naturally, that bleeds over into the IT infrastructure. So when security gets involved, we start to validate it. Yes, we start validating IT controls, such as, are you even, so talking about logging, using this use case, are you even logging how much you want to be logging? Or not? Yeah, we're sending logs. To what level of depth and visibility? We've gone in, run assessments where Pantera was picked up immediately because of the level of logging visibility that was there. And there's been other times where not so much. You're still it's logging, right? But it's not. And that's where it goes back to what you were saying. I wanted to add some color. There's so much gray. It's not black and white. It's not binary on or off. There's so much in between that is happening that when we start to take a look, we say, oh, we thought we deployed an agent, or we did deploy an agent, but the agent for some reason didn't start because of a build that changed on the image. Or it's saying that it's reporting, but in reality, when we actually run the test, Pantera is getting through. So this, and again, something like Itanium, it could be other IT controls that we're expecting to see. And if we're not just getting the visibility that we expect to see because we're testing, now we know. Now we can make changes and make attempts to fill those gaps.
You must have seen great success stories when it comes to security validation, and I want you to give it a quick overview or example of those success story where you were able to reduce the risk when you deploy security validation in your organization, where the security leader actually evangelized this new approach? I'll call it new because it's still kind of at the part where it's not as simple and adopted, where we have antivirus or EDR tools. Give us that example or the success story.
Sure. I mean, I have a couple. Really, when for security leaders, justification or an understanding of what they've done, if it's not working or if it is working, either way, it sometimes is a win. There have been times where we've gone in, and I've had the privilege over my career to work for different technologies and engineering different solutions, and they're not always easy to roll out or operationalize. It can be very heavy, based on what we were just saying, right? Working with IT.
Yeah.
When you go into validate, security teams and leaders can now actually take some of this validation and say, look, we didn't roll this all the way out because there was some pushback or whatever XYZ reason, but look at the risk that is still present. We need to do this.
Yeah.
So let's prioritize it. And that gives them almost more evidence to say, look, we need to push security further. Don't take my word for it. We're lucky we caught this before threat actors did. So it's not necessarily the risk hasn't happened, like nothing has happened yet, but it's happening. You're using security validation as the catalyst to say, yeah, this could have happened, but now we can prevent it.
Yeah.
Now, in the same manner, you walk around the trade show floor, you spend thousands, hundreds of thousands, not millions of dollars on technology. You want to know if it's working right. So even if you don't find anything, now you could say, yes, it is working right. We know it is. I can be confident to say that the programs and the things that we've started to implement is working and we are protected because here are the results. So in both of those scenarios, whether we're walking in and we're moving laterally or not, now we can address those gaps. And if we're not doing any of that, it's great. You now know with confidence that what you've done is working.
Right. I think let's switch the gears. We talked about the challenges. We talked about adoption. We talked about the success stories. Once everything is said and done, when you apply this mindset here, and now your security engineers can run these security validations continuously, when you go into the board today, and if there's a new threat actor playing in the market here in the wild, can you take this approach and quantify it, that can we protect it, can we detect it, and here are my results?
Oh, absolutely. I think, I said something earlier on, which is how much is too much. Over the last maybe three years, insurance premiums have shot up through the roof, right? And then just with the press that hacks and breaches and all that have been getting, there is a push, and validly, right? So there's been a push by organizations to stock up on the security, and people are investing. And then it also doesn't help with the industry. Now it's like, slicing and dicing hair. You have in the same space, let's take identities as a total segue. We had workforce identity for such a long time, and then we had privilege identity.
Yeah.
And that was it, right? The big players in this space, your CyberArks, your Oktas, and so on. And then over the last 3-4 years, you then have SaaS identity, you have cloud identity, you have vendors that just focus not on the user identity, but on the application identity, and then you now have entitlements management. So, like I say, it's splits and hairs. It's you just get to the point where you are down to one tool solving for this little tiny use case here, and it's just, at some point, you've got to ask yourself, how much am I moving the needle forward?
Yeah.
Right? If you have a security maturity score of, let's just use CMMI, of 4 out of 5, how much are you willing to invest to get from 4 over 5 to 4.1 over 5?
Yeah.
And that's really what the reality is, because you can spend $1 million on brand new controls and it only gets you a 0.1% change. In some cases, it doesn't do anything, right? So you mentioned consolidation earlier. We've got to use tools to understand effectiveness, right? Going back to standards like ISO, the ISO 27001 framework, they go on about measurement of effectiveness. When you put a control in, how effective is it? I'll take another with the recent news of what's happened with United Healthcare, the breach that's been going around, and AT&T and others, one of the things we see on LinkedIn, unfortunately, and I think this is rather unfortunate, is when an organization goes through a breach, you get all these vendors and other professional CISOs and others who are quick to comment about what additional controls they should have had in place, and if they had this one software, it would have prevented this breach from happening. And I always go back to, maybe what we should do is every time that there is a breach, we should publish a list of all the applications, all the controls that a company had in place when they had a breach.
Yeah.
And what you will find is that most organizations have enough of a security stack to prevent the breach. The problem is it wasn't fully implemented, meaning deployed across the board.
Yeah.
It wasn't effectively implemented in the sense that people were not using the tools to the full capacity or capability of those tools. Now, in some cases, there's just negligence. People are just not doing the jobs.
Yeah.
Right? But if you have a means of independently validating scope, deployment, and there's so many ways you can do it. You mentioned one part of it is the validation of it.
Yeah.
But the other part of it is, what do you get? How do you report upwards? So with my teams, for instance, I put them through the paces with reporting, because I don't have the time to go into every single tool and every single console to monitor and to see what's going on. But if you have a means to roll up the reports to say, tell me what our vulnerability looks like, tell me what our user security awareness looks like, tell me what our external attack surface management score looks like, and you roll that up, and then you are then using that as a measure to then probe and ask further questions. That keeps everyone else on their toes. They know they have to use the tools and be more effective and do their jobs more appropriately. And so, but the ability to do that test is what drives behavior change across your business.
So that's a good point, Amy, that you brought up, where it's cyber insurance is now looking at it. They don't want to just look at if you have implemented, but also how effective it is. Jay, when you're talking to your customers, and in the industry here, talking to security leaders, tell me, our audience, how you are preaching them and telling them about how to quantify your security program, because it is a hard job as it is. It doesn't fly that we can say, consider your security program as insurance, because if something goes wrong, you want to have this insurance. It's not enough anymore. That argument doesn't fly. So how do you quantify what you have put into your security program now?
Yeah, it all depends what you have there, of course. I hate the answer, it depends, but to be honest, in our line of work, we see a lot of different things on the menu from a program perspective. Typically, though, what I'm more focused on is the processes. Controls are, yes, they're great, they need to be there, but how are you, just because they're there, what are you doing as a result? What are you doing with the output of the data? Are alerts, alerts should be actionable items, right? Well, who's getting the alert? What's the escalation process? Or you're getting a report. Okay, reports being consumed by whom? And when we talk about measuring and the metrics around that, that's where I go back to, okay, well, you drafted policy, or you want playbook ABC, let's see if it actually plays out that way. And there have been times people run into the room, and everyone's really panicked. We go, okay, and the team kind of gets a laugh. I feel bad for these people because they didn't realize this was happening, but at least they know, okay, this was good. But we could say with a checkbox, yes, we actually responded on time. I've seen where third-party MSSPs, they're delivering great information. We can cross-reference it in Pentera, and we say, this remote code execution went, here it is. They find it, awesome. We consider that a success. There have been times we've gone in, we've executed a proof of value in the day time frame, we walk out, and then they're getting response hours after we've left. We're not even there anymore. Right? So you're looking at two different scenarios, where one scenario shows great results of, yeah, we actually found it, here are the results, and others not so much. So when I think of measurement, I want to put everything to the test. I want to almost run through either a tabletop or run through that exercise as the attacker, and let's see how everything responds. Right.
Here's a tough one for you, Jay. When you're getting in front of your customers and you're talking about this great concept of security validation and how they should adopt, talk them through about the challenges and how to overcome that, I'm sure you've heard this before, but I have my penetration testers, internal or external, for that matter. They're doing it either every quarter, twice in a year, annual, whatever that is. Why do I need this? They're doing it already. Why do I need this?
And to that I respond, okay, I completely get that, it's great. You're doing something, right? So
Yeah.
you started somewhere. And then I just ask the question, so how often are you bringing new people in? How often are you rolling out a new application? How often are you running change management? It's a rhetorical question because it's continuous.
Right.
So wouldn't you, for example, again, rhetorical question, I just kind of discuss from a risk perspective. So if you onboard somebody and they have certain privileges, going back to the privileged identity space that we were talking about, and they have certain privileges, well, would you consider that an increase of your risk footprint? Yes or no? If no, well, we have a separate conversation to talk about. But if yes, then okay, so then your risk has increased. Wouldn't you want to validate and make sure that that risk isn't expanded or that you have controls around that?
Right.
So it's always just it has to be a recognition that the environment's changing too often to not test continuously. So yeah, you're doing something, it's great to do something, but you need to do it more often.
Right.
And you don't want to wait for the attackers to show that to you, and you don't want to ever assume. Don't assume, validate.
And I would just add to that, I think the other aspect of that is just about scope. Right? We've all done pen testing, we've all scoped pen test, right? And I have never met or even heard of anyone who's done a pen test and covered the entire organization, right?
Right.
You have, let's take a retail environment. You have 1,000 stores. What do? You send the pen testers to maybe 3 different locations. If you had a legacy and a sort of modern, more next-gen network, maybe you take one legacy network, one next-gen network, and then
Yeah.
you test. You have, 30,000 IP addresses within your organization? How many do you test?
Yeah.
10, 20 of those? You have 6,000 servers. How many servers do you test? So the point about penetration testing in the way we've done it traditionally, it's really just a sample exercise, right? It doesn't give you, it's like doing a finger test and then giving yourself a whole body assessment and saying that you're healthy. It sounds ridiculous, but that's exactly what we do. And so the point about doing continuous validation is you're not going to test everything
Right.
at once, but you have the ability to systematically go through the entire environment and test as needed, right, over time.
Yeah.
Rather than the 2 weeks a year where you do your pen testing and then assume that that gives you a clean bill of health for the rest of your organization. And that has been a personal sort of pet peeve within the security industry. Let's switch topics a little bit to what we do with third-party risk management.
Yeah.
Same thing. You're engaging with a vendor. They're going to be in your system every day doing a whole bunch of operational things. But you get them to bring in a document,
Yeah.
dated, if you're lucky, in the last 12 months, in most cases longer, of a sample assessment that was done. They put that in front of you, and that constitutes due diligence to say that this vendor is great. Or worse still, you have an existing vendor, which I really like the example you gave. You have an existing vendor relationship with a company, and over time, the business unit has increased the scope of work that this vendor does, or the services that you have delivered to your organization. And you're still holding on to the security assessment you did when you first engaged with them 3 years ago, 4 years ago. It's a paper exercise.
Yep.
And what continual security validation does is it gets us away from the paper-based, compliance-centric way
Yeah.
of doing security and making security control validation more operational.
Yeah.
Because it's in the operations, that's when organizations get breached. It's in the patching, it's in the vulnerability assessments, it's in the misconfiguration of code. No paper exercise. You can misconfigure code a day after you get, or pen test report with no material findings. If you're not able to validate after the fact, then you're not really validating at all. So that's kind of the way I look at it.
Yeah, and I see this as more like Tetris. I see these different pieces where compliance reports are required because it covers the whole, the length of it. It checks all the compliance, and it also kind of gives you that certification with the government bodies. You need pen testers for certain areas where you just can't have it automated security validation. But the last, I see that as an 80% chunk is where you can have security validation testing automatically, autonomously at scale. I think that's where I see it, where we have ignored it, because we consider that 20% of, as you said, compliance report, or once a year, twice a year, 4 times a year, that pen test. That's 20%. I think the 80% is still left, where we need to test this after every change control if needed, or after every application deployed if needed, or you know what? Surprise. Go test and find out if the security controls are effective or not.
I think also when you look at how the nature of the environments are expanding, right? So we talked about attack surface management. Now we're into cloud. Everything is interconnected. So having that full picture really helps. And the other thing is that there's still a human component to all of this, and we can use scalability, all the the auto scalability in the cloud and that sort of thing. But all it takes is one person to have a bad day, and I know I have plenty of bad days. And I make one little mistake on my config, and then that gets rolled out widespread. If I'm not validating those controls, I could be in a world of hurt.
For sure, for sure. One other argument we have heard, and maybe I'll toss this question to you, where CISO security leaders are hearing these concerns from their staff members that you're bringing this automated tool now to validate security controls. Is it threatening my job? And usually my response to that CISO security leader is that, have you not went to your CEO or CFO asking for open recs? That means you have more work than people. You need something that can help you. At Pacific Dental, when you considered this mindset and adopt it and actually operationalize it, how did that happen with your staff members and team members, where they're like, this is now automatic going to happen, is it going to threaten my job or not?
Well, I think I like the way you pose the question, because I kind of have a very, very different view to it. I think being effective at the jobs we have enables us keep our jobs, it doesn't pose a threat to our jobs, right? If you are meant to be in a security operations team and you're meant to be validating security controls across the organization, let's say head of HR, who approved that job, who's writing a check or signing a check at the end of the day, they don't understand the nuances that you have to deal with. What they know is they have a security operations team that should be validating and should be watching. Even though you're only 9 to 5, they expect you to be monitoring and validating the environment 24/7.
Great point.
And the fact is, we don't have the tools to do that. So why shy away from embracing the help you need to help you keep the job you have, rather than worry about losing a job? It's just a false argument. Now, people have that argument, but I would say, like most things, it's just, you've got to look at it differently. This allows you to do your job the right way. And then you mentioned the human component. We are talking about validation. We haven't really spent a lot of time looking at remediation. So in a lot of cases, tools like this can do auto remediation if you want, but most organizations will still want a human to check, to be in that loop. So this allows you to focus your attention, focus your time, your resources at the areas where you get the most bang for your buck. So I come into work in the morning, I've had some validation tests run overnight, I know what to go after. I know how to prioritize my day. I know when, over time, because everything ultimately in security is risk-based, maybe you get to the point where there's some low-hanging fruit, high volume perhaps, low complexity, that you can then trust the automation that various platforms provide, so you can then run those, and then you can then focus your time on, hopefully, the higher end, more complex things that give you fulfillment at the end of the day. That, hey, I went to work and I actually had a really good day and I solved some real problems, rather than spending my time updating Windows 10 or looking for unencrypted S3 buckets or whatever. So this allows us to focus our efforts where it really counts, and I think it's a good thing.
Yeah, yeah. Jay, when you're talking to your customers and industry, there is an output to this input. So input is you need to have security validation, you set up those critical assets, you measure against those 5-10 controls. There's an output to that. Who's responsible for actually taking action items and actually running with it? Because yes, the problems will be surfaced. Some of those will be addressed automatically. Some of those require human intelligence and human intervention. Who is responsible for that part?
Well, the actual doing of the work is a lot of times a joint effort between the security team and whoever. A lot of times it's the infrastructure team, the identity team, the Windows team, whomever, because again, like SIEM, security validation touches so many different technologies because you're now validating so many things. So typically, the security team will say, here's our findings.
Yeah.
This is the gap we've seen, and we need to adjust our policies accordingly. But what does that mean for you guys, right? And it has to be an ongoing joint effort.
Right.
So it's a mix of all the teams in understanding, well, if we make this change, what's the implication to the business? Well, it's going to introduce more, and then that becomes the dance of risk versus convenience, security versus convenience. It's a very, very fine line. I think to answer your question, it's always a joint effort. It's never just a security team, and it's never just one team. This whole purple teaming mindset that we've heard, right? And when people go, oh, I'm on the purple team, like, wait a minute. Really what you mean is you're trying to work together to make things happen. And so it's never just one team. It's always a conglomerate of multiple different teams, and the security team's always involved.
Fair, fair. As we peel off, and for our audience and listeners, we want to give key takeaways from this session. So, Naomi, I'll start with you. What would you want to share with your fellow security leaders and CISOs that when it comes to security validation, where to start and how to adopt it?
I think the one thing that I would say is you just have to do it, right? The scope of how you do it, how aggressive you are, that depends on your organization and your level of maturity. But once you've done validation, you need to have a process that follows that, right? You get the data that comes in, how does that go? And to the last point about purple teaming and all that, who's responsible for running with those reports? Who's responsible for making sure that those controls are as deployed, wide-reaching, and as effective efficacy as you intended them to be? And then figure out a way to roll that into your reporting level. Ideally, that should roll all the way into the board, but if you're not at that point yet, it should at least roll from the various SMEs, the various security domains, or just IT application domains. It should roll up into whatever you want to call it, security leader dashboard, CISO dashboard. There should be something that gets to you so you have an independent way on the fly to have some sense of how effective your overall security program is. Because if you don't do that, then going back to the Deming cycle, I always like talking about it, right? The plan, do, check, act. You've got to have a plan, you've got to execute on your plan, you've got to check, is kind of what we're talking about today. And then if you're not hitting those lofty goals that you set for yourself, then you've got to do something about it. And then just when you think you're done, you're going to start the whole process all over again. And that's really the job. So this is just another tool in the toolkit that helps us do our jobs better, I think.
Fair, fair. Jay, give us your final thoughts on this section.
I think just leveraging that mindset of the attacker will give you a whole nother lens to look at things. And not to make your life a little bit harder, right? But it goes back to what you were saying. It's the check. It's the check. Defense in depth, we've been doing it for years. It's time to start practicing validation in depth at different layers. Stop assuming, validate, start doing it as soon as you can, and leverage other security leaders like we're doing here and your peers to understand what's worked for them. And you can, I think the conversation that we have amongst ourselves as security professionals goes such a long way because there's so much we can learn from each other, and that's what it's all about, is learning from each other and taking steps in the right direction.
Awesome, awesome. And I'll leave you all with this one. This is seen as a red teamer or hacker where that only the red teamers should be coming in and doing security validation. I actually see it the other way around. I think that we are empowering the blue teamer or the defensive team, where defenders now have the ability to check and validate what they have deployed, what they have set up controls. And a lot of time it goes unnoticed, unsung heroes, that the work we have done, this is how you can also quantify the work you have done. And over the years, you can show that the progress you have made by just continuously validating the security controls. With that, I want to thank you, both of you, for being on this webinar. Really appreciate your thoughts on it. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in and watching this show. Thank you.